Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is V for Vendetta. Now, V for Vendetta is a graphic novel written by Alan Moore and illustrated by David Lloyd. Now, this was originally published as what was intended to be an ongoing comic strip between the years 1982 and 1985 in a British anthology called Warrior. However, only the first 2 quarters of the story were published in Warrior. Alan Moore didn't finish the story until the late 80s when DC Comics published V for Vendetta as a 10-issue limited comic book series between the years 1988 and 1989. And then later on, all the issues of the series were collected into one graphic novel or trade paperback. Now, later collected editions of V for Vendetta were published under DC's imprint Vertigo, which is what DC used to use to publish their more adult-oriented comics. Now, Vertigo, unfortunately, has been discontinued in 2018, so now any new reprintings of V for Vendetta would be published under DC's Black Label, which from what I understand has largely taken the place of Vertigo. Now, I already reviewed V for Vendetta all the way back in 2012. That review is still up, however, it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out my 2012 review of this book. Now, at the time Alan Moore started working on V for Vendetta, he also completely reinvented the character of Swamp Thing with his run on Saga of the Swamp Thing. He also created the character of John Constantine for that series, who would later get spun off into the Hellblazer comics. Alan Moore also wrote comics and graphic novels like Watchmen, which is considered by many to be the greatest comic book ever written. He also wrote From Hell. He created the comic book series The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He also wrote the Batman comic The Killing Joke, which is considered by many to be the greatest Joker story ever told. Alan Moore has actually been called the Shakespeare of comics. Now, while that might be hyperbole, I do actually consider Alan Moore to be one of the best popular writers of the 20th century. For me, he's right up there with Clive Barker, Stephen King, even Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson. Now, while Watchmen is my personal favorite of Alan Moore's work, I think in a lot of ways V for Vendetta has kind of become his most important work, and this is also considered to be kind of an important piece of dystopian fiction, with many people holding it right up there with dystopian novels like George Orwell's 1984 or Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Now, the plot of V for Vendetta is it's set in the not-too-distant future. It's actually set in the late 1990s, which, keep in mind, when the graphic novel was written, would have been the future. But basically, in the graphic novel's universe, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union eventually escalate to nuclear conflict. But England is more or less spared in this nuclear holocaust. However, the nuclear holocaust does bring about a devastating climate change that brings floods and famine to large parts of the country. And in the early 1990s, a fascist far-right extremist group takes control of the country, and much like the Nazis during World War II, they ended up rounding up all the minorities, so all the Jews, all the black people, all the homosexuals, and anybody who simply spoke out against them were rounded up and sent to these extermination camps. But the book begins on November 5th, 1997, and this fascist government has already been in power for several years now, and the atrocities that they committed have pretty much been forgotten by the public. But in the beginning of the story, we follow a 16-year-old girl named Evey Hammond who, desperate to make ends meet, ends up becoming a prostitute, and that night she ends up soliciting a group of men for sex, not realizing that they're actually members of the government's secret police, who attempt to rape and kill her, but then she's saved by a vigilante in a Guy Fawkes mask. This vigilante, who calls himself V, is revealed to be an anarchist terrorist terrorist when he blows up one of the buildings of Parliament, but Evey comes to trust him, and throughout the course of the story, he ends up taking her under his wing, and Evey ends up becoming V's right hand. Now, V's ultimate goal is to bring down this fascist government, but in the beginning of the comic, he starts targeting certain people who work for the government, each of whom has a connection to one of these death camps. And you come to realize that what he's doing is both a political statement as well as an act of revenge. And in the graphic novel, we follow a detective named Finch and his partner who are trying to figure out who V is and put a stop to his actions, but as the comic goes on, Finch starts to become challenged in his beliefs and his loyalty towards the government, and he starts to wonder, should we really be trying to stop V? Or does this government deserve to fall? But yeah, V for Vendetta is an excellent comic, and is easily one of Alan Moore's best works. Now, I do like Watchmen better on a personal level, but as I said before, this is probably Alan Moore's most important work. And not only is this one of the best comics of the 1980s, but this is also one of the great dystopian novels, and the themes of this graphic novel, unfortunately, are still prescient to this day. Some may argue even more so. Now, I did hear that Alan Moore really doesn't like the term graphic novel, and to a certain extent I can understand why, because you do have a lot of pretentious douchebags who say things like, "Oh, I don't read comic books, I read graphic novels." Meanwhile, it's like, a graphic novel is a comic book, you doofus. But if there ever were comics where the term graphic novel applied, I feel it would be Alan Moore's comics like V for Vendetta and Watchmen and From Hell, because those comics really do almost read like novels. Like, I really do feel like Alan Moore does blur the line between comic books and literature. Now, arguably the biggest theme of V for Vendetta is fascism or totalitarianism versus anarchy, two political extremes. Now, while the book is certainly not pro-fascist by any means, and you can tell from Alan Moore's political views that he ultimately does want us to fall on V's side, something that was really important to Alan Moore was to not paint the characters in black and white, but more in a shade of grey. Like, he wanted to show the people working within this fascist government not as two-dimensional bad guys, but rather just as people who have been indoctrinated into this belief, and he wanted to kind of show both sides of the fence to some degree. And the blame is ultimately placed on the people for their complacency in allowing this government to come to power.
I didn't want to just come into this as a self-confessed anarchist and say, right, here's this anarchist, here's the good guy, here's all these bad fascists, they're the bad guys. I mean, that's trivial and insulting to the reader. I wanted to present some of the fascists as being ordinary and, in some instances, even likeable human beings. They weren't just Nazi cartoons with monocles and University of Heidelberg dueling scars. You know, they were people who had made their choices for a reason. Sometimes that reason was cowardice. Sometimes that reason was wanting to get on. Sometimes it was a genuine belief in those principles. So we suggest that, yeah, the Nazis, they weren't from space. They weren't from the depths of hell. They were butchers and street sweepers and school teachers and ordinary people from ordinary works of life. They weren't monsters, but they just went along.
Now, there are certain characters in the story that V goes after who I would consider to be pure evil, like the child-molesting priest that V goes after at one point, who you find out worked at this extermination camp, which is why V is going after him. That character certainly is evil, in my opinion. But then you have the character of Adam Susan, who is basically the dictator of England. He's the leader of this fascist government, and while he is a character who, in my opinion, is evil. He's a deeply bigoted man. You do get his point of view in a lot of sections of this book, and you do kind of understand why he thinks the way that he does. Now, he views civil liberties and personal freedoms as a threat to a secure society, which to me is such an ass-backwards way of thinking. But you know what? There are actual dictators in our world today who feel that way and use that as a justification for their power. And in the story, Adam Susan, who for all intents and purposes you could say is the antagonist of the novel, he's portrayed as a very shy, awkward man, and also a man who is severely mentally ill. And I like in the book how there is sort of a power struggle within this government, and there are certain people working within the government who want to start a coup against Adam Susan. And at the same time, while you could call V the hero of the novel, is he really? Because the book does imply that V might just be crazy and might not even know what he's talking about. And the same way that a lot of the people working within this fascist government have simply been indoctrinated into this belief system, is Evey not being indoctrinated by V? And V actually does do some things in this comic that could be considered evil, like he actually kidnaps Evey at one point, posing as the police, and still posing as the police, he actually tortures her, and he claims later on that this was to free her, but it's like, is she not being brainwashed by V? And Alan Moore very much leaves that open to the reader to decide how we should feel about that. Also, her name is really important, Evey, or Eve, and there are a lot of points in the story where V does compare himself to the devil, so in a way it's almost like the devil or the snake tempting Eve. And the book very much leaves it open to interpretation whether Evey and V's relationship is a positive one or a deeply troubling and toxic one. Now, there's also sort of a subtle father-daughter relationship between V and Evey, because you never find out who V actually is. All you know about V is he's somebody who survived and escaped one of these extermination camps, but you never find out what his true identity is. And you find out that Evey's father, because of his political activism, was actually taken away to one of these extermination camps, so there is the subtle implication that maybe V is actually Evey's father, but you never find that out for sure, because ultimately it doesn't matter who's behind the mask. V is not really the person behind the mask. He is the mask. He has made himself the living embodiment of an idea. Now, one of the most powerful and heartbreaking moments of this book was the chapter Valerie, where we find out about this gay actress who was taken to the same concentration camp that V was from, because gay people are one of the main minorities that this regime went after when they first came to power, and Valerie's story is just so sad and so heartbreaking. And that's something that Alan Moore does really well, is he creates these little side stories or subplots that seem like they don't have anything to do with the main narrative, but then you realize, no, they're so important to the main narrative. In fact, the main narrative would not be the same if not for these little side stories. Another really sad subplot in the book was the character of Rosemary, who was the widow of the head of security for the government, who we see V kill earlier on in the comic, and after her husband dies, she's basically close to living on the streets, and in order to support herself, she's forced to become a showgirl and a stripper. And you feel so bad for this character, not only because of her current situation, but even before her husband died, her husband was extremely abusive towards her, so this poor woman is constantly being exploited by men throughout the course of the comic, and her story might just seem like a subplot that doesn't really have anything to do with the main narrative, but one, it shows the negative consequences of the things that V is doing, but also her story story ends up having major ramifications for the end of the novel. Now, for me, the most compelling character in the graphic novel was actually Finch, and the arc that you see this character go on really is fascinating. How he starts off the comic as this really dedicated detective who is basically a good man, even though he is working for this fascist government. And throughout the course of the story, you see him become more and more disillusioned with the government, especially when he finds out more about what went on at these death camps. And there's a moment in the comic where Finch, in order to get inside V's head and try to think like he does, goes to the now abandoned death camp where V was from, and he takes LSD. And he has this hallucination where all the minorities that the government wiped out from the country are surrounding him, and then they go away. And it's a really powerful scene. Oh Jesus, I've missed you. I've missed your voices, and your walk, your food, your clothes, your dyed pink hair. My friends, they're at the carnival, the gay pride marches. Say you saw beyond my uniform. Please say you knew I cared. Wait, where are you going? Please don't leave me. We've treated you so badly, all the hateful things we've printed, did, and said. But please, don't despise us. We were stupid. We were kids. We didn't know. Come back. Oh, please, come back. And in that scene, you get some real insight into Finch's character. He might not have taken part in this mass genocide that his government committed, but he still stood by and did nothing while this happened. Now, in this video, I've been giving all the credit to Alan Moore, but I really haven't given enough credit to David Lloyd, the illustrator, and apparently it was his idea to give V the Guy Fawkes mask. But his artwork in this is amazing, and it has a real sort of melancholy tone to it that really fits the sad, bleak world that these characters live in. But yeah, V for Vendetta is an amazing book. It's an excellent example of the comic book medium and the kind of things you could do with comics, but it's also an amazing dystopian novel. And again, for me, it's right up there with George Orwell's 1984, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, or Stephen King's The Running Man, or even Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange. And it's a book that's still relevant and prescient to this day, and in some ways it was kind of prophetic. Only a few years after Alan Moore started working on this comic, Margaret Thatcher actually did introduce some anti-gay legislation.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated.
Around about 1988, we've got this this woman, Mrs. Thatcher. Anybody? And she sort of decided to bring in this clause that was called Clause 28. And what that was designed to do was to not just oppress gay people. It was a real piece of Nazi legislation. It was designed to actually remove the concept of gay people from the dictionary. It was that schools could not teach anything that was pro-homosexual, which means that they couldn't mention it, because mentioning it would have been seen as being pro-homosexuality. This was unsupportable.
Now, this was adapted into the 2005 film of the same name. Now, before I talk about the movie, I just want to cut to some friends of mine giving their thoughts on V for Vendetta.
V for Vendetta is Alan Moore's finest work. It's my favorite graphic novel of all time. I think that it is the ultimate story when it comes to political stories. It is the epitome of like the George Orwells and all that stuff. Just amazing story. Now, it's interesting because V for Vendetta, I actually watched the movie first. So when I saw the movie, you know, where it's more liberal versus conservative. I thought that's what the comic book was about. So I picked it up, and it was interesting to find out, no, it's actually anarchy versus totalitarianism, which is like, what the hell? It was just so different than the movie, so that threw me off. But I actually liked the comic book a lot more, and I thought that the way that he was able to show both sides of the story was fantastic. I love hearing both sides of an argument. I love seeing the villains as people, not just as villains, not just as crazy, one-dimensional monsters, but I love villains who have a purpose, who have a reason for being a villain, who have complexity. They have basically, they think they're doing the right thing, and I love that he's able to portray the good side of totalitarianism to a degree. I know that he thinks that the story is completely neutral, and I know a lot of people think that it's very, very neutral, that there is no one side or the other, but you could kind of tell that he does side with one more than the other. He's more anarchist, obviously, than totalitarian. It just comes off that way, and if you look at the end of the story, it pretty much is that way. I do like that V is complex himself. I do like that he could be considered the villain of the story. I mean, he is a terrorist. And let's be honest, we see terrorists always as villains in movies or in books. Sometimes, especially nowadays, they're showing how that might not always be the case. But for the most part, a terrorist is seen as a villain, that there is no good side to being a terrorist. But the idea that V is the quote-unquote hero of the story, and yet he's killing people and blowing things up and, just being crazy pretty much, because he's insane, let's be honest. It's fantastic. I thought Alan Moore did a great job. The dialogue in this book is amazing. I think that Alan Moore's writing is top-notch. I mean, what else are you going to say? It's Alan Moore. He is a very good writer, a fantastic writer. He's beautiful, beautiful writing style. The artwork is fantastic. I love the grit. I love how it looks. It looks kind of ugly, but I don't mean ugly in a bad way. Ugly like in a beautiful way. Like you could tell, like it's a very gritty, dark story based on how it's drawn, how the people look. They don't look like the pretty DC Marvel characters that you see. They're, it's more, I don't want to say realistic, because realistic makes it sound like I'm talking about Alex Ross. But, like, it's just gritty. It's just a very gritty art style, and I love how it's put together. I think that the artwork is fantastic. I love V's look. V, to me, is one of the greatest costumes ever. The fact that anybody can be behind that mask, that truly is what Spider-Man was trying to do. Because Spider-Man, at the end of the day, he takes off his mask, he's Peter Parker. Let's be honest, even his voice and everything, you can see that is Peter Parker. Batman, the same thing. And yet they always say, kids can picture themselves behind that mask. No, you can really picture yourself behind V's mask. And I like that in real life. There are people who wear the mask and they protest and all that stuff, and his character pretty much came to life. I think that's fantastic. But yeah, the story, fantastic. It's paced very slow, and I don't mean very slow like, it's boring. No, it's paced in a slow pace. It's Alan Moore, if you know his story style, Watchmen and all that. He does have a slower pace than other comic book writers, so if you're not ready for that, you might just want to be careful. If you like your stories more fast-paced, just pick it up with caution, I would say. I wouldn't say go out and buy like a special edition and then next thing you know, you hated it. I would say, rent it or something and just see first. But if you do like story, if you do like character development, you like your stories to take its time and not rush everything. You're not always about action-packed and all that stuff. Even though there's action in it, it's just that it's not crazy like, Deceased is or something. It's more of it's almost like a novel, just with pictures. It literally is that. How you would read a novel, that's pretty much how you read Alan Moore's story. So, if you want to read it, if you've never read Alan Moore book, this probably would be the one that you should check out first. Watchmen is another one, but I would say, actually, if you're used to regular superhero stories, you might want to pick up V for Vendetta and kind of work your way into Watchmen, because the difference between a Batman story like Court of the Owls and Watchmen, it will freaking kill you. It will kill you how realistic Watchmen is. So I would say pick up V for Vendetta so you can check out his writing style. See if you like it, and check it out. And if you're an Alan Moore fan and you haven't read V for Vendetta, go out and get it. I highly recommend it to everybody. I think that it's just great. I've read it many times. Like I said, I love it. And thank you so much.
Hello everyone, Christian asked what my thoughts and opinions are on the V for Vendetta graphic novel by Alan Moore. After reading Alan Moore's Watchmen or other comic books for the first time, I read V for Vendetta was back in 2016. It was a comic book I was very familiar with in the past because of the iconic face of V from comic book conventions, people dressed as the character, or people who protest against the government wear that mask. One way to describe V for Vendetta was like the story 1984 by George Orwell, which I'll admit I've never read, with some Escape from New York vibes by John Carpenter, but of course, Alan Moore made his own story. Just like The Watchmen, the story was another alternate history on what if the government had total control, domination, and fascism. The comic also points out how that we as a society feel powerless from the government, not to sound like a conspiracy theorist or anything, but Alan Moore points out that how the government is more afraid of us than we are of them. The character of Evey was an interesting character, not your stereotypical superhero like Batman, Superman, or other superheroes like Spider-Man, Daredevil, the Hulk. He was an anti-hero, three-dimensional character who was trying to speak the truth, and that the people of Britain should not be afraid of the government. The character of Evey was also an interesting character when she tells V her background story about her childhood, on how her and her family had some rough patches from economics and the war. They treat her the same way they treat people who were in the Holocaust in a way. It was a big twist and shock that V was responsible for her kidnap, proving his point why this should never happen. Thank you, Christian, for asking me my thoughts and opinions on V for Vendetta.
It's been a long time since I've read V for Vendetta, but I remember really enjoying it. A great story of an anarchist trying to get justice for what was done to him and also free a future totalitarian Britain from its oppressors. And Alan Moore just does such a great job making you understand why V does what he does, while also showing that he's got issues of his own. He represents an ideal of what an anarchist would want society to be. He's also quite ruthless in pursuing that ideal. A scene in the graphic novel that really stuck out to me was the scene in which V burns all of this guy's prized dolls. This guy was one of the people responsible for keeping V in a concentration camp, and he valued his dolls more than the lives of real people. And I also like the part in which he kills another person who ran the concentration camps and how she's accepting of her fate and asks to see his face one last time. I remember thinking that part was somewhat touching. All in all, it's just a great story, and Alan Moore's writing is brilliant. I was lucky enough to get Alan Moore's autograph back in 2013. I wrote to him through the mail and sent out these 2 computer paper photos of the covers to Watchmen and Batman the Killing Joke. He sent them back, both unsigned, with a note from his assistant saying that due to the fact that he doesn't sign any of his works that he doesn't own, he was not able to sign my photos. However, he also sent back a signed copy of Nemo, Heart of Ice, which I still have and cherish in my collection to this very day. Anyway, that's my review of V for Vendetta. Take care, everyone.
So V for Vendetta is, I think, one of the more pure Alan stories. And what I mean by that is stuff that kind of comes from his sensibilities, like, for instance, From Hell, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. All these stories are really just about ideals, and how they affect the world, how they affect society, how we live our lives. League of Extraordinary Gentlemen had the ideal of superheroism, about trying to be something better than human and trying to live up to an ideal. And then the ending comes with the message that, there's nothing wrong with being human. And it's good to just know who you are and work with that. And then From Hell was just literally about how fucked the world was in Victorian London, and how much different it is now, and how it's similar at the same time. So with V for Vendetta, the whole concept of it is fascism versus anarchy. And I think it's such a brilliant back and forth in this story. V is a great sort of, I like to call them placeholder characters, because he exists, but he's not a person. He's an entity. He wears a mask. We never see his face. We never learn what his real name is. He's there, you know, and we kind of fill in the blanks. Evey is there to kind of be the audience surrogate, and we learn about him through her. We learn about what his goals are, but the thing is, we never fully have a concrete idea on what he is and what he's after, because he could just be a psycho. He could just be, you know, really a whiny bitch in a costume. There's so many different ways to look at him, so it's really just up to the reader to figure out how they feel about V. But I love this whole idea of a near future story where fascism is starting to take over, and somebody kind of just says, enough is enough, you know, fuck that. We need to be about freedom, and we need to believe in people, not in figures, not in leaders. It's really about the masses, and that's what a lot of us forget. Like anything Alan writes, it's got such an interesting structure. There's an entire issue or chapter is a better word. An entire chapter that is basically structured almost like an old opera. Those little brilliant touches that he puts in to kind of make it different and make it his own, and to see how the audience will respond to it. So, yeah, this is just pure classic Alan. I love the ending. So ambiguous, but you kind of know what's coming next anyway. The whole thing is just a cycle that's going to repeat itself. And maybe that's supposed to reflect how society is with politics and how society is with ideals. Because nothing ever properly gets solved. You know, it's always just... everything just keeps moving, and we're dealing with the same problems we've always dealt with. We just deal with it in different forms or in different ways as time goes on. I mean, you know, you look at what just happened since 2016, where, you know, people felt like we were going into a fascist state, and it was a fascist state that was kind of all about freedom, you know? The irony that people were trying to tell you how to think and try to tell you how to be, and all this political correctness and stuff. Yet, you know, the big irony was people really weren't giving a shit about letting other people have opinions. You know, it was about locking everything down and kind of forcing people to feel a certain way.
Now, as I alluded to before, in 2005 we had a film adaptation of V for Vendetta. Well, technically, I think it only got a limited release in 2005. It didn't get a wide release until 2006. Now, the movie was directed by James McTeague, I think is how you say his name, and it was written by the Wachowskis, who, prior to that, wrote and directed The Matrix, which is probably what they're best known for. Now, I know Alan Moore hated the movie, and I know a lot of fans of the comic hate the movie, and I can understand why. To a certain extent, the movie does kind of miss the point of the graphic novel, in a way, but in a way it's also, I think, pretty true to the graphic novel. It does portray V more as a straight-out hero, and it portrays the people working within this fascist government more as out-and-out villains, which is exactly what Alan Moore was trying to avoid in the comic. The movie makes things a little more cut and dry, and it also portrays Evey and V's relationship in a much more positive light, whereas in the book, it was left more up to the reader's interpretation how we should feel about their relationship. In the movie, it's clear that James James McTeague and the Wachowskis want us to kind of be on the side of Evey and V's relationship. The issue is, in the movie, you still have that scene where V kidnaps Evey, posing as, like, the police and then torturing her. Like, the movie still has that scene, but I actually really like the movie. It might not necessarily be a great adaptation of the comic, but as a standalone movie, I think it's a really good action dystopian film. Now, in the movie, Hugo Weaving plays V, and it's a fantastic performance despite never actually seeing his face in the movie. In the movie, Natalie Portman plays Evey, and she's actually really good in the movie. Now, in the movie, they make Evey a lot older. In the comic, she was in her late teens, whereas in the movie, it's clear that she's in either her late 20s or early 30s. In the movie, John Hurt plays Adam Sutler, who is the analog to Adam Susan, and he's a much more two-dimensional bad guy in the movie, whereas in the comic, the character was a little more nuanced. Now, I don't know this for sure, but I've heard that John Hurt being casted in the movie was sort of a tribute to the fact that he played Winston Smith in the 1984 adaptation of George Orwell's 1984. As sort of a tribute to that movie, being that 1984 is in a lot of ways the quintessential dystopian story. Stephen Ree is also really good as Detective Finch, however the character doesn't have nearly the same complexity that he has in the graphic novel. One standout performance in the movie for me was Stephen Fry as the character of Diedrich, who is a character from the comic. However, in the comic, he's a low-level criminal that Evey ends up falling in love with, whereas in the movie, they're really just friends, and he's actually a TV host in the movie, later revealed to secretly be gay. The movie also handles the whole story of Valerie beautifully, but again, the movie makes things a little more black and white, whereas in the book it was a little more nuanced, so I can understand why people didn't like that, and the movie also cuts out a lot of subplots from the book and leaves out a lot of characters or changes a lot of characters, but that's any adaptation, really. The movie's also very post 9/11, even though it's still set in England, you could tell the Wachowskis are very much making a statement about the George Bush administration, and things like the Patriot Act and George Bush's anti-terrorism policies. Also, Islamophobia is a big thing in the movie, where you find out that anybody caught with a copy of the Quran is executed. So again, you could tell it's a very post-9/11 movie, but I like the movie. I like the movie a lot. It's a little less subtle than the graphic novel, but I still think it's a really good movie on its own. Now, before I talk about the cultural impact of both the book and the movie, I want to cut to those same friends of mine you heard from before, giving their thoughts on the film.
When it comes to the movie of V for Vendetta, it's interesting how they did pretty much what Alan Moore hates about his movie adaptations, which is they take the basic concept and then change a lot of it. Because where in the book, it's about anarchy versus totalitarianism, or fascism, if you want to go there. In the movie, it's about left versus right. It's about liberals versus conservatives. And the main reason that you can't even say that it's even close to anarchy is probably from one of the most famous lines in the movie, which is that people should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of the people. Now, if V is an anarchist, he's really not for any government. You know, he's against the government. He thinks it should be destroyed. So that right there shows you that he's more of a liberal. They do push some liberal values in there, which, you know, I like. I don't mind it. I'm not saying this to be negative or anything like that. I'm just saying that that's what it is, and I like the story. Hey, you know, and I like the changes. Yeah, I would love a straight adaptation of the book. I really would. If they're going to do another V for Vendetta and they want to just do a straight adaptation or kind of modernize it a little bit and add the anarchy versus the government, that would be fine. It's just that I don't mind the changes. I like the movie a lot. Hugo Weaving is amazing as V. This is his greatest role, and he's been in many great roles. I mean, almost every character he's played is iconic. Not just like, famous and everybody knows. No, he's iconic. Okay, Hugo Weaving is an icon. Every character he's played is just legendary and will live down in history forever. Whether it's Agent Smith, whether it's why am I forgetting his name from Lord of the Rings? And that annoys me because I love Lord of the Rings so much. He's the elf. Whether he's the Red Skull in Captain America, he's just always iconic. All these characters that he plays is just amazing. His acting is fantastic. In fact, if you didn't know going into the movie that was Hugo Weaving, you wouldn't know. Because first of all, he doesn't take off his mask, which I love about the story. I hate in superhero movies where the people just take off their masks for no reason. Spider-Man is saving a train from falling off the tracks and he takes off his mask. It's like in front of all these people, dude, they're gonna figure out who you are. Like, I just love that the Wachowski brothers, they decided not to take off the mask. And okay, you could kind of argue that, okay, one scene he doesn't have the mask on, whatever. But the point is, you don't really know it's him when that happens. So it's fine. It's fine that they did that. That's fine. That doesn't count. The fact is that in the movie, Hugo Weaving does not take his mask off, and I thought that was a brilliant thing. The lines are fantastic. The writing is beautiful. The action is fantastic. Ooh, I love the action in V for Vendetta. It's just, it's really, really good. The messages obviously still stand today. There's political groups out there that are protesters and stuff that are using V's message for their agendas, and that is, I don't want to get too political. I don't want to push my views on anybody at all. But I will say this, that I actually enjoy the fact that V has inspired people to fight against tyranny and corruption in the government. And I'm glad that he has inspired people to take down illegal websites and criminals on the internet. That's as far as I go with that. That's all I'm going to say about that. I don't really want to talk politics. I'm not really a political guy, but I'm glad that this movie has had that impact on people and our society. I've watched this movie many times. I love it. Natalie Portman is fantastic. She's always great, except in Star Wars, but we won't talk about that. We won't go into that again. Everybody's great. It's just a really good movie. Everything is fantastic. The editing, special effects, everything. It's a great movie, and I highly recommend it if you haven't watched it for any reason, whether it's because maybe you just don't like Alan Moore adaptations. Trust me, this is actually one of the best of his adaptations. I like Watchmen a lot, the movie, but this one is probably the best adaptation of his stories, because even The Killing Joke screwed up on some things, but this one did not. This one is actually great. I know that he hates it, but he hates all of his stuff, so that doesn't count, His opinion on the matter is his opinion, and it's fine, and I respect it. It's just that I wouldn't take that as why I wouldn't watch something. I don't listen to other people's opinions and think, what, I shouldn't check out something. If I want to check something out, I'm gonna check it out. So I highly recommend that you watch this movie. It's not too crazy. It's not anything that like somebody like a teenager can't watch. So if you want to check it out too, if you're younger and you want to watch this, you can, and then use this to get into the book. Because movies to me are the ambassadors for books. So it's great. Highly recommend it for everybody to check it out. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. And yeah, bye-bye.
Okay, so here's my review of V for Vendetta, the movie. I remember I was 12 years old at the time in 2006 when the movie came out. I didn't see it in the movie theaters at the time when it came out. I didn't see the film, read the comic book until 10 years later in 2016. At the time when the movie came out, being a diehard comic book fan I was at that time, it didn't give me much of a thought until I was older to see the movie or read the comic. Well, I haven't seen the movie in a long time. From what I remember seeing, I thought the movie was okay. Not great or perfect, a very good solid comic book adaptation. I thought Hugo Weaving did a good job as V. He really made the character realistic and felt like he was born to be the character. His voice was perfect. It was interesting to read that they had another actor during film playing the character of V, but was fired halfway through film and then they replaced him with Hugo Weaving. I can't remember his name. It was obvious he was chosen by the Wachowski brothers, or should I say, the Wachowski sisters now. Because of playing Agent Smith in the Matrix films is why he was chosen for the character of V. It surprised me with their names on the title. One would think that the Wachowski brothers would have directed this film after the success of the Matrix films. Natalie Portman was great. She's one of my all-time favorite actresses. I remember when the movie came out when she was promoting Star Wars Revenge of the Sith at the time. So that was my brief review of V for Vendetta. Happy New Year, Christian, and thank you for having me be a part of this.
So it's interesting how these stories always manage to reflect the real world, no matter what period of time you're in, which is a good way to seg into the story of the movie, which I understand why Alan doesn't like the movie. I totally get it, because first off, it's his fucking baby. He wrote it. He has the right to not like an adaptation. That's totally up to him. It's totally understandable. But at the same time, as a fan of him, it's again, fuck fascism. It's okay to have your own opinion. And I like the movie. And I like the movie for the reason he hates it. The movie really is Americans trying to criticize the Bush administration. And they're using this story as a way to do it, And it works. It works really well if you look at it that way. But at the same time, it still works in the same way that the comic does, where, we're criticizing fascism and we're talking about, if anarchy has value and, maybe that we should roll the clocks back to a simpler time or a simpler way of doing things. But then, you also got to worry about the consequences of that. What would happen if anarchy ran rampant. But no, I enjoy the movie. It's definitely sort of Americanized, but I mean, I'm American, so I can't help it, I guess. So yeah, I love both. I love the book. I love the movie. I think this is such a great idea and such a great way to analyze debates between, two conflicting ideals, and such great characters, such a cool concept. Basically like a political parable with a superhero at the center of it, or like, a superhero disguised as a terrorist, or, better yet, the other way around. So I love V for Vendetta very much, and I highly, highly recommend it.
Now, imagery from both the graphic novel and the movie, but arguably more so the movie, really has become indented in culture. Not necessarily pop culture, but actually politics, believe it or not. Like, the Guy Fawkes mask from this book has been used at a lot of protests like the Occupy Wall Street movement or the protest in Hong Kong as sort of a symbol of standing up to oppression. V has also become kind of the mascot for the hacktivist group Anonymous. But yeah, that was my review on V for Vendetta, written by Alan Moore and illustrated by David Lloyd, and bye.